We continue today in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and we're right in the middle of this plot sequence that we've been showing. So let's look where we are, and then we'll jump right into our passage. So last time we looked at this unit here, where it was framed by Hannah's blessing and Samuel's growth, and Eli chose on his own to upbraid his sons for corruption. Now we get right at the center, Eli himself is upbraided by an anonymous man of God. And here it's simply monologue. It's only this man of God who speaks. Eli does not respond. And as you can see here, when we jump to the very end of it, the narrator just jumps right in at the beginning of chapter 3 and talks about Samuel. So we don't know Eli's response to this, and it certainly strikes us as a stylized insert here, and many scholars have read it that way, as a number of passages like this we'll see way later in the Deuteronomistic history. For example, another man of God comes to Jeroboam. Later, we'll see this one here, and proclaims of the fate of him, and that in the future someone named Josiah will come. And most scholars would take that as written from the time of Josiah to justify, retrospectively, if you will, retroactively perhaps, the authority of Josiah as having been predicted by a man of God. Here we'll see that the authority of the man of God, which is simply assumed to be the voice of Yahweh, Eli doesn't test it, doesn't speak, and no one else does. So we just assume that this is a reliable voice here, expressing Yahweh's viewpoint. There's no reason to think otherwise. And yet the monotone nature of this here suggests that it's inserted to express the writer's perspective. And the question is, that perspective from when? So we need to look more closely to see what this little speech is saying about somebody's view about Eli, the priesthood, monarchy, and the fate of Israel over the long haul. So let's jump right in. So we saw the ending here, of the last section, the quick shift here from the boy Samuel continuing to grow, and then suddenly a man of God with no intervention at all. As Jobling says, the message of this whole passage, in his view, is that Yahweh can and will annul everlasting covenants. The covenant of priesthood with Phinehas was clearly stated in Numbers 25:13 to be permanent. This startling discovery that everlasting covenants are not necessarily so adjusts our entire theoretical notion of kingship and creates a precedent that will weigh heavily in the later treatment of the royal houses of Saul and David. So to make sense of that, we're going to have to look at the details. But just to note, that's Jobling's view from the start, that this passage is there to raise questions about even Yahweh's claims to offer promises that last forever. So let's jump in. So a man of God. What is a man of God? The only previous reference to a man of God in the chronological sequence of the Bible as we're reading it is Judges 13:6, and that's the announcement of the birth of Samson from this woman who's his mother. And notice the similarity to what Hannah says to Eli and to Yahweh about Samuel. Well, she'll drink no wine or strong drink, eat nothing unclean. The boy shall be a Nazarite to God. And we recall the word Nazarite is not in the Hebrew or Greek in 1 Samuel. It is in the Samson story. So perhaps later writers are trying to harmonize what is clearly a link here between Judges 13 and the call of Samuel here. And as I just noted, there are a few other references to it. Almost always the characters described as man of God are outsiders. The only one that we know of is named as Elijah, and he's certainly an outsider over against the house of Omri in Israel, the evil king Ahab and others. That he confronts as an outsider prophet. But he is specifically described as a prophet, and this person is not, even though what he's doing is exactly what prophets do, which is they speak in the name of Yahweh about how the consequences of past choices will have results in the future. This anonymous man of God came to Eli and said to him, "Thus Yahweh has said," and we need to look at a number of the details of the Hebrew here to make sense of some of this. "So I revealed myself," and here it is a word for revealed, but it's one of those double words in Hebrew that underscores the emphatic nature of it. So there's no secret here. "I revealed myself to the family of your ancestor in Egypt when they were slaves to the house of Pharaoh." So a couple things we need to do. We need to look at the language here, and then we need to consider this reference to the Exodus and what that is telling us about the Samuel story, at least this piece of the Samuel story, in relation to, if not the book of Exodus, the tradition of Exodus, because people could know about a tradition of having been slaves in Egypt without necessarily knowing the canonical book of Exodus as we have it in the Bible now. So let's look at some of the details. I revealed myself to the family of your ancestor, literally to the house of your father, Albayat Avikah. And that reminds us of the issue that we've been looking at all along, that this book is divided into houses. So by saying family of your ancestor rather than house of your father, it's missing the many plays on words that we'll see on Bayit or Bait on house. So the house of Eli includes these people, and we've seen this many so far, and here's the man of God in the next section. And we'll see references to these later sons, and they'll only come up in chapter 4. But then there'll be the long-term references that are referred to implicitly here. So the house of your father is the issue. That brings up another issue, but we'll look at that in a moment when we look at tribes. So the house of your ancestor in Egypt. This is the first reference to Egypt in the book of Samuel in chapter 2. Then there are a few others as we see. If we jump ahead, we'll see that they're similar, recalling the Exodus in one way or another. So and this is in the call for a king. They've rejected me. If we go back a verse, says Yahweh, just as they have done to me, they're rejecting you, Samuel, from the day I brought them out of Egypt to this day. So these various recollections of the Exodus, what does that tell us? There are obviously several options. One is that the Exodus narrative was written before the entire Deuteronomistic history, and in the order perhaps that we see it in the chronological Bible that we have, and these people are calling on it. The problem with that, among other things, is where's Moses? We certainly don't hear about Moses, and Moses is obviously the main character in the books from Exodus through Deuteronomy. So that's one issue. Another is we don't really hear anything about any of the institutions that Deuteronomy and Exodus seem to establish, like things like the Sabbath or the Ten Commandments or other things like that. So there doesn't seem to be any sense of the Exodus book as not only a recollection of the liberation from Egypt, but as a provision of a covenant in the wilderness that provides an alternative way to live. And as I argue at length in my book, Come Out My People, the Exodus story in many ways is telling a counter-narrative to this monarchy story, suggesting that the way to do God's will is to be liberated from a king rather than be subservient to a king. So there are many ambiguities about the question of the relationship between the Exodus tradition, or more broadly the Egypt tradition, which is obviously beyond Exodus, included also in Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers as well. So we just don't know. So we're going to treat these as if they're insertions from some later person, calling upon that as a justification for who Yahweh is as a liberator. So I revealed myself to the house of your father in Egypt when they were slaves to the house of Pharaoh. A very rare use of Pharaoh here, only here and one other time. Why should you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? So again, example of how there's a tradition of Egypt, but not much specific link to the Exodus story as we have it now. So the first reality is that Yahweh has been revealed to Eli's ancestors, house of Eli. And that's certainly a reference to Phinehas, son of Aaron. First here in Numbers 25:7 with Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest. So that's the first reference there, but we see it here in 31:6. Another reference, Moses sent them to war, 1,000 from each tribe, along with Phinehas, son of Eleazar. So there are many examples of Eleazar and Phinehas, sons of Aaron, as leading the Israelites alongside Moses. So that's the tradition that's being referred back here. I chose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest. And a few things to look at here. The verb for choose, bachar, here is first here in Samuel, next at 8:18, which is very fitting. Note all the links here between chapter 2 and chapter 8, the call for a king here. In that day you will cry out because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves. So here it is that Yahweh has chosen him, in this case the Aaronid people, as you see from the Exodus tradition. These are the records of the tabernacle of the covenant drawn up at the commandment of Moses, the work of the Levites, being under the direction of Ithamar, son of the priest Aaron. So the Levites under the authority of Aaron here. That's the earliest reference, at least in the sequence we have. So we're going to see throughout this entire narrative the tension between Yahweh's choosing and the people's choosing. There are many examples here, including in 10:24. Samuel said to all the people, "Do you not see the one whom Yahweh has chosen?" Which is to say, Saul at that point. So the people choose a king in general, the Yahweh chooses a king in particular, and choosing is what it's all about. And of course, in the Deuteronomistic history, that echoes into Deuteronomy 30. I set before you life and death, choose life. So we'll see that really throughout the entire Hebrew Bible, the issue is the people aligning their choosing with Yahweh's choosing. We can read that from the Garden of Eden forward. So all the tribes of Israel, this is a rare use of tribes here. Shevet is the word for tribe. We see there are a number of uses, but they're never enumerated. There's never a sense of 12 tribes. There's just this sense of tribal unit. It refers probably back to usage in Judges. And so it's time for us to pause for a moment and consider, if you're not familiar with it, the structure of social order according to the Bible among the people of Israel. And I have this little chart here that shows you the Hebrew words and what they mean as a social unit, how many times they were used in the Hebrew Bible total, and how many times in the Deuteronomistic history they're used. So the basic unit, as we already saw in the verse of 4, was Bayit, here in the family of your ancestors, Bayit Ab, the father's house. Used 157 times in the Hebrew Bible, but only a quarter of those in Deuteronomistic history, which is to highlight that it's not really about families at that level, in the way like Genesis is. It's about nations and kings at that level. Although we'll see a lot of family issues. It's not that it's not used, it's just not as used as others. Mishpachah, which is what we could understand as an extended family, the cousins and aunts and uncles who would be in a village context, the extended village of belonging that would hold people together. And you see that's twice Bayit Ab in the Hebrew Bible, but only a few more times in Deuteronomistic history, so only 20% are in the Deuteronomistic history there. Shevet is the word here for tribe. And I have named tribe. It doesn't necessarily mean that each one is named, but a unit of the tribes. And here it's collectively all the tribes. But if we were to look back in Judges, we saw that tension between the tribe of Benjamin and the rest of Israel, which is going to become an issue with the selection of Saul from Benjamin. So 190 uses in the Hebrew Bible, and about half of them in Deuteronomistic history. So Shevet, at that larger level, is a more common usage. And of course, that's the basis by which musters were made for battle against Philistines and others. And then I wasn't able to search these out in detail just because of a technical issue, but two ways to refer to all of Israel this way, apart from all Israel. Bnei Yisrael, which literally means the sons of Israel, referring back to the sense from Genesis that Jacob became Israel and that the tribal names here are literally his sons. So in an extended sense, Bnei Yisrael is the children of Israel, or Am Yisrael, the people of Israel as a whole. 189 names total, and only 47, a quarter of those in Deuteronomistic history. But what is common is this Kal Yisrael, all Israel. In other words, not referred to in a familial way or in a collective human way in the sense of a people, but just simply a collective entity known as Israel. And that's going to be important because it's not going to be clear exactly what Israel is. For example, in relation to Benjamin, in relation to Judah, or in relation to others as well. We'll have to explore that as we go. We certainly can't equate it with a map of modern-day nation-state of Israel that you could see today. So those are some of the social units that we'll see, and our author is using two of those here to highlight that. So he's revealed to the Bayit Ab of the priest and chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, as Saul and David will be chosen, in this case to be a priest. And one of the issues that Polzin is leading us to walk through is how much here is priesthood a stand-in for monarchy, and how much are they connected. And they're obviously connected because the king needs a priest to justify why he has authority from Yahweh. And true, like in every monarchical world in the ancient times, where the priesthood and the monarchy are deeply connected. So the priest is chosen to do several things: to go up to my altar, to offer incense, to wear an ephod before me. To go up to this is the first use of altar here. Only a couple of times you'll notice. There's not a lot of work at altars going on. To offer incense, which connects with the making smoke that we saw that Eli's sons were supposed to do with the meat that they otherwise were, or with the fat of the meat they were otherwise taking here. to offer incense to wear the ephod, and we already saw about the ephod. I gave to the family of your ancestor, again to the house of your father, all my offerings by fire. It's an unusual word here, only in these two other places, to underscore the fire smoke aspect of the priestly role. So given that, and that's often the case here, given all I, Yahweh, have done for you, then why have you not responded in kind? I note here, this is a little bit from Paul's and a little bit of my own work here. Notice that everything that's being said here will also apply to Saul vis-a-vis David later. Fattening yourself on the offerings, as Saul is said to do, eyeing David's prosperity, or what more technically, as we'll see, what God has done for David, have two sons die on the same day, and the issue of building a sure house. So there's certainly multiple layers going on here, and that will make more sense as we work our way through it all. So the translations here are really tricky. There's a lot of challenges, and I won't belabor it, but we need to look at it a little bit. So again, why then look with greedy eye literally is, why do you kick at my sacrifice? Tsumura again helps us here. He suggests, why do you always despise the sacrifice? So it's not about greed, it's about disrespect. Why do you disrespect my sacrifice and the offerings that I commanded? I note here the New RSV omits what is in the Hebrew in my dwelling place or my shrine, which can be taken. So the Net Bible suggests, why are you scorning my sacrifice and my offering that I commanded for my dwelling place? Perhaps the NRSV omits it because it anticipates that as anachronistic in relation to the temple, which obviously had been built yet, but it is there in the Hebrew, and at this point it certainly suggests Shiloh, not Jerusalem, where Eli's been offering things, and of course where Elkanah went up to offer. So disrespecting and honoring your sons more than me, which can easily be read as honoring kings or giving glory to your sons, the kings, more than me, by fattening yourself, again underscoring the fattening that the Eli's sons were doing with the meat on the choicest part of every offering of my people Israel, or the choicest is first fruits, highlighting that they were supposed to get the best, or God was supposed to get the best, but they're taking it. And now we have my people Israel. So we've seen tribes of Israel, your family or your house, and now my people Israel, first time. So given that little trial scene, in a sense, I've done this for you, then why then have you disrespected me therefore? And this is where Jobling's point comes to be, because there had been, I promise that your family, again your house, and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be treated with contempt. And this is Jobling's point that, right explicitly here is something that was promised forever is now going to be taken away. But there's another twist, as we'll see. So now Yahweh declares, far be it from me, a proclamation of disavowing of previous intent. And notice the sequence here, that God will respond to people as they respond to God. It's not offering unconditional honor or unconditional contempt. It's, how you treat me, Yahweh says, is how I will treat you. And then we see the predictions that will be fulfilled both within the Saul and David story and at the conclusion of the entire monarchy history, all being predicted here in advance, or maybe after the fact, in advance in the sequence of the story, but maybe after the fact in the sequence of composition. So see, a time is coming, or literally, hine, behold, a day is coming, when I will cut off your strength. The verb for cut off here, good here, is not the usual verb for cutting a covenant, karoth, which would make a nice wordplay here, which is sometimes done. It's certainly done in the circumcision story in Genesis 17, where a covenant is cut, just as Abraham's penis is cut, as a sign of that. So a time is coming when I will cut off your strength here, literally your arm, often an expression of military power, both for Yahweh's and others. But obviously not literally cutting off your arm, but I'll cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that no one in your family will live to old age. And we're going to see that lived out not lived out very momentarily. Then in distress you will look with greedy eye on all the prosperity. A very difficult translation here. We won't worry about the details because I think you can get the basic point. The Net has, you will see trouble in my dwelling place. Notice that the dwelling place is not highlighted in the New RSV. Israel will experience blessings, but there will not be an old man in your house for all time. So clearly, whatever the details are, Israel is going to be in distress, and Eli's family is not going to last. So the only one of whom I will not cut off, and Brueggemann suggests these last verses are probably added even later to legitimize subsequent developments of priestly power, a theme that Brueggemann looks at a lot, about how many of the texts in the Bible were written to justify conflicting priestly groups' authority. We're not going to get in those kinds of details here, but just to note that Brueggemann highlights that often. The only one of you, and that's referring to Abiathar ahead here, so we can see that here, where all the priests are killed except for Abiathar, who escapes. So the only one of you will not cut off shall be spared to weep out his eyes and grieve his heart. Literally, to wear out your eyes and cause your life to waste away. It's interesting how often the Hebrew reveals a very earthy, physical kind of language to describe suffering in ways that our English often does not. Cause your life to waste away. And all the members of your household shall die by the sword. That's referring to that incident I just showed you where Doeg kills 85 of the priests. And now it gets personal, not just about those people off in some future, but the immediate fate of the two sons, which we'll see in just a couple of chapters. And fate is not a good word here. It's not in Hebrew or the Septuagint. Note how the net again renders it, this will be a confirming sign for you. So the Hebrew word here taken as an adjective describing the sign. So your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, there'll be a sign, and the sign is their death. In other words, that what the man of God saying, the truth of it will be verified by their death on the same day, which of course we'll see momentarily. And once the house of Eli then is destroyed, except for the one remnant, Abiathar, Yahweh will raise up for myself, again the stand-up issue, as you saw with Hannah earlier, and we'll see it again with Samuel in a moment, raise up for myself a faithful priest. The Hebrew Naaman means sure, and that has to do with being established or secure. So the issue isn't so much that the priest is faithful personally, but that there's security that this priest will do the right thing and will not fall down on the job, so to speak. And we'll see that very soon. So Yahweh will raise up a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind, or literally my nephesh, which is a curious thing because nephesh is not a word that's usually possessive. When God makes human beings in Genesis, it says, and it became a nephesh, a living being. So it's a very curious usage, and honestly, I've not been able to find any other place. Maybe if any of you are detectives out there who get a Reddit group looking at this, you can tell me a time where it refers to Yahweh's nephesh apart from this. So that priest will have a sure house, and now, of course, the play on house plays out here. So we can see that in place of the house of Eli is now going to be a sure house. And this priest will go in and out before my Messiah, my anointed one, forever, which is to say the priest and the king will be united in expressing Yahweh's will, at least as long as there's a king. And note the irony here is that having refuted that a covenant was forever, it ends with forever. So here it is here that the previous thing that was about forever now gets repeated again. And do we trust it this time? Do we have any more reason to trust that this will go on forever any more than the one that Yahweh just refuted will go on forever? We'll find out soon enough, won't we? Or maybe we won't. Maybe that's outside the frame of the story, and we only find out knowing the bigger historical narrative. And so finally it concludes with this prediction here, and as Polza notes, the fate of Eli's house shimmers the reflections of the sardonic picture of Jehoiakim in chains at 2 Kings 25, which is to say at the very end of the Deuteronomistic history, we'll see the king captured and eating bread at the Babylonian king's table. It also implies here that anyone left in your house shall come to implore him for a piece of silver. This is recalling here Hannah's statement here in her song, those were full of hired themselves out for bread. So we see already her predictions, her prayers coming true in the sense that Eli's family will be left hired out for bread and begging to put me in one of the priest's places that I may eat a morsel of bread. So the house of Eli will come crashing down. All that's left is the execution of it. But before that, we will see Samuel continued to be raised up. And this will be Samuel's first direct encounter with Yahweh. And it's a classic call story. It's one that maybe you learned as a child, of the child Samuel in bed, not sure who that voice is, and having to be taught, ironically, by the condemned priest Eli, that it was the voice of Yahweh. We'll hear that encounter in our next session. See you then. Bye-bye.